The most feared man in the underworld was escorting his future bride home until a flash of red hair in a crosswalk stopped his heart. He was staring at his ex-lover holding 3 infants that shared his eyes. Alfredo Melendez adjusted the heavy gold watch on his wrist as his custom Mercedes glided through the rain-slicked city streets. Behind him, 2 black SUVs acted as shadows, a constant reminder that for the head of the Melendez syndicate, peace was an expensive illusion. Beside him sat Anaya Garrett. In her striking red dress and hair pulled into a flawless topknot, she was the picture of cold ambition. She was the alliance his empire needed, a strategic necessity dressed in diamonds and expensive perfume. They were the city's ultimate power couple, living a life of calculated silence and political maneuvers. The silence inside the Mercedes was thick, almost suffocating. The scent of Anaya's perfume, something French and ridiculously expensive, filled the cabin like a claim of ownership. She was checking her reflection in the visor mirror, talking about the merger that would consolidate their territory, her voice smooth and businesslike. Alfredo wore his mask of indifference perfectly, nodding at appropriate intervals, his expression carved from stone. He had perfected this performance over the years. Show nothing. Feel nothing. Survive everything. He looked through the tinted, bulletproof glass at the sea of pedestrians, ordinary people living lives untouched by the violence he commanded. They walked with their heads down, hurrying through the rain, blissfully unaware that one of the city's most dangerous men was watching them from behind armor-plated doors. Then, as the traffic light turned a deep, warning red, the world outside seemed to freeze. A woman stepped into the crosswalk. She moved with a protective hunch, her auburn hair falling in tangled strands over a face that looked like it had been through a war. Even through the glass, Alfredo could see the dark, ugly bruise blooming across her cheekbone, a violent splash of purple and black that made his stomach turn. She looked like a ghost of the woman he once knew, her eyes shadowed by a level of exhaustion that went deeper than bone. This wasn't the careful fatigue of sleepless nights. This was the hollow-eyed desperation of someone who had stopped counting the days since she last felt safe. Strapped to her chest in a heavy gray carrier were 3 tiny infants, their heads covered in matching beanies. Triplets. Leo, Luca, and Lexi, though Alfredo didn't know their names yet. What he did know, what hit him like a bullet to the chest, were their eyes. Even from this distance, even through the rain and the tinted glass, he could see them. Dark, intense, unmistakable. His eyes. Alfredo's hands, which had never flinched while holding a weapon, now gripped the leather steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The gold of his watch caught the red glow of the traffic light, a stark reminder of the luxury that separated his world from hers. It had been exactly 2 years since he told Aaliyah Carter she didn't belong in his world, 2 years since he had pushed her away to save her from the shadows of his life. He had been so certain, so righteous in his cruelty. He had told himself it was noble, that walking away was the sacrifice love demanded. But nobility didn't leave bruises on a woman's face. Sacrifice didn't put 3 infants in a carrier on the chest of someone who looked like she hadn't eaten in days. His mind began calculating the timeline with the cold precision he usually reserved for hostile takeovers and territorial disputes. 2 years ago he had ended things. No explanation, no second chances, just a clean break designed to cut her loose before his enemies could use her against him. If she had been pregnant then, if she had carried his children alone through 9 months of hell, if she had given birth to triplets without his money, his protection, his name, then every moment of her suffering was his fault. The realization didn't come gently. It crashed through him like a freight train, demolishing the careful lies he had built to justify his abandonment. The light turned green, but Alfredo's foot stayed frozen on the brake. His entire body had locked up, muscles rigid with a shock so profound it felt like drowning. Aaliyah was already moving away, disappearing into the dark alleyways of the city's roughest district, the kind of neighborhood where people didn't ask questions and bodies were found in dumpsters. Alfredo, the driver behind us, is waiting. Anaya's voice cut through the cabin, sharp and irritated. She had finally looked up from her mirror, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows pulled together in annoyance. Then her gaze followed his, landing on Aaliyah's retreating figure. Her expression shifted, something cold and calculating flickering behind her eyes. "Do you know that homeless woman?" Alfredo forced his expression back into the mask he wore so well, even as his pulse hammered a drumbeat of panic against his ribs. He pressed down on the accelerator, the Mercedes pulling forward smoothly as if nothing had changed. As if his entire world hadn't just shattered in the space of a red light. No one important, he lied, his voice steady and dismissive. But as the car pulled away and Aaliyah disappeared into the darkness, the bulletproof life he had built felt suddenly violently fragile. He had spent 2 years convincing himself that walking away was a noble sacrifice, that cutting her loose had saved her from the dangerous reality of loving a man like him. Yet seeing her battered, broken, and carrying 3 lives he never knew existed, he realized his protection had been her death sentence. The syndicate he chose over her, the empire he built in her absence, the violence he wielded so casually, all of it felt hollow now. Meaningless. Because somewhere in this city, the only woman who ever truly saw the man behind the monster was raising his children alone. And judging by the bruise on her face and the exhaustion in her eyes, she was losing a war he didn't even know she was fighting. The moment Anaya's heels clicked away from the Mercedes and disappeared into her penthouse lobby, Alfredo pulled out his encrypted phone. His hands were steadier now, the initial shock replaced by something far more dangerous. Cold, calculated fury. He dialed a number he reserved for emergencies, for the kind of problems that required absolute discretion and ruthless efficiency. Mateo. My office. 20 minutes. He didn't wait for a response before ending the call. Mateo Reyes, his underboss and the only man in the organization Alfredo trusted with his life, would understand the tone. This wasn't a request. This was a summons that demanded answers, the kind that came with bodies if those answers disappointed. Alfredo drove through the city with a focus that bordered on obsession, his mind replaying that moment in the crosswalk over and over like a broken film reel. The bruise on Aaliyah's face. The weight of 3 infants strapped to her chest. The hollow exhaustion in her eyes. Every detail carved itself deeper into his conscience. A conscience he had spent years convincing himself didn't exist. By the time he reached his private office, the one hidden behind a legitimate import-export business on the waterfront, Mateo was already waiting. The underboss stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, his expression carefully neutral. Mateo had been with Alfredo since the beginning, back when the Melendez syndicate was just 2 angry kids with more ambition than sense. He knew how to read his boss, and right now, every line of Alfredo's body screamed danger. I need everything on Aaliyah Carter, Alfredo said without preamble, pouring himself 3 fingers of whiskey he didn't plan to drink. The last 24 months. Where she's living, what she's doing, who she's talking to. I want bank records, employment history, medical records if you can get them. Everything. Mateo's eyebrows lifted slightly, the only indication of his surprise. Aaliyah Carter. Your ex from 2 years ago. Yes. May I ask why the sudden interest? Alfredo's jaw tightened. He could have lied, could have manufactured some story about loose ends or potential security risks. But Mateo had earned honesty even when that honesty tasted like poison. I saw her tonight. He's got 3 kids. Triplets. They look about 18 months old. The math hung in the air between them, brutal and undeniable. Mateo's expression shifted from neutral to carefully blank, the look of a man processing information he wished he didn't have. I'll get you everything by morning. No. I want preliminary information in 2 hours. Full deep dive by dawn. Mateo nodded once and left without another word. The door clicked shut with a finality that made Alfredo's chest tighten. He stood alone in his office, surrounded by the trappings of his empire. Imported leather furniture, original artwork, a safe behind a painting that held enough cash to buy a small country. All of it suddenly felt obscene. He moved to his desk and opened his laptop, accessing the secure server that housed his most sensitive financial records. 2 years ago, the night he walked away from Aaliyah, he had done one thing right. Or so he thought. He had set up an offshore account in her name, a safety net loaded with enough money to ensure she would never want for anything. $2 million, transferred in untraceable increments, with instructions that she could access it at any time, no questions asked. It was supposed to be his parting gift, the proof that even though he was walking away, he still cared enough to protect her from a distance. Alfredo navigated through layers of encrypted folders until he found the account. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard, some part of him already knowing what he would find. He clicked. Balance. $0. Last transaction. 23 months ago. A full withdrawal processed by Melendez Holdings International, one of his own shell companies. The whiskey glass in his hand shattered. He hadn't even realized he was squeezing it until blood mixed with expensive liquor on his palm. The pain was distant, irrelevant compared to the white-hot rage flooding his system. Someone had stolen from her. Someone in his organization had intercepted the one thing he had done to keep her safe, had drained that account days after he walked away and left her with nothing. He grabbed his phone, ignoring the blood dripping onto the screen. Mateo, the offshore account I set up for Aaliyah Carter 2 years ago. I need to know who authorized the withdrawal from Melendez Holdings International. I need names, dates and authorization codes. Now. 2 hours later, Mateo returned with a manila folder that looked thin enough to be insulting. He set it on Alfredo's desk with the careful reverence of someone handling a live grenade. Preliminary report. The full investigation is ongoing, but I thought you'd want to see this immediately. Alfredo opened the folder. The first thing he saw was a photograph, and it hit him harder than any bullet ever could. Aaliyah stood outside a rundown tenement building, the kind of place where gunshots were background noise and everyone minded their own business because survival depended on blindness. She was holding 2 of the triplets while the third was strapped to her back in a makeshift carrier. Her face was turned toward the camera, captured in harsh afternoon light that highlighted the bruise he had seen earlier and several others he hadn't. A yellowish one fading on her jaw, finger-shaped marks on her upper arm. She's living in the Hollows, Mateo said quietly. The Hollows was what locals called the tenement district on the east side, a neighborhood so rough that even Alfredo's syndicate had trouble maintaining control there. It was a place where people went to disappear, where desperation turned neighbors into predators. Alfredo forced himself to look at the next photograph. Aaliyah in a stained cleaning uniform, scrubbing floors at what looked like a fish processing plant on the wharf. The timestamp read 3 a.m. The next photo showed her in a different uniform, industrial laundry facility, night shift. Then another, a 24-hour diner, her hair pulled back, exhaustion written in every line of her body. She's working 3 jobs, Mateo confirmed. Cleaner at Morrison's Wharf from midnight to 6. Laundress at Spotless Industrial from 7 to 3. Waitress at Eddie's Diner from 4 to midnight on weekends. She's averaging maybe 4 hours of sleep a night, and that's generous. Alfredo's hands trembled as he set down the photographs. 3 jobs. Raising triplets alone. Living in a war zone. All while he slept in silk sheets and complained about the temperature of his imported coffee. There's more, Mateo continued, his voice carefully neutral. I pulled records from the post office. Over the last 2 years, approximately 17 letters were sent from various Melendez business addresses to her last known location. None of them were delivered. They were all marked return to sender, and rerouted back to a P.O. box registered to Melendez Holdings. The same shell company that drained her account. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture so ugly that Alfredo felt physically sick. Someone intercepted everything. The money, the letters, any attempt I made to check on her. It appears that way, yes. I'm working on identifying who had access to that P.O. box and authorization codes for the shell company. Whoever did this knew your protocols well enough to cover their tracks. We're looking at someone high up in the organization. Well, someone close enough to know about Aaliyah, smart enough to intercept his safeguards, and cruel enough to leave her destitute and alone. The betrayal burned almost as hot as the guilt, a toxic combination that made Alfredo want to put his fist through the wall. But rage wouldn't help Aaliyah. Rage wouldn't feed his children or heal the bruises on their mother's face. He needed to be smart about this, surgical. He needed to find the traitor, eliminate the threat, and somehow fix the catastrophic damage his protection had caused. Keep digging, Alfredo ordered, his voice low and dangerous. I want to know who did this and I want to know why. But quietly, Mateo. Whoever intercepted that money is still in the organization, and I don't want them knowing we're looking. Mateo nodded and turned to leave, but Alfredo's voice stopped him at the door. And Mateo? Find out everything you can about the triplets. Medical records, birth certificates, anything. I need to know if they're mine. Even as he said it, Alfredo knew the answer. He had seen those eyes, dark and intense, mirrors of his own. But he needed confirmation, needed the concrete proof that would justify what he was about to do next. Because once he confirmed those children were his, There was no force on earth that would keep him from bringing them home. Even if it meant burning his entire empire to the ground. Anaya Garrett didn't sleep that night. She stood in her penthouse overlooking the glittering city, a glass of Chateau Margaux in one hand and her phone in the other, replaying the moment in the Mercedes when Alfredo's entire body had gone rigid at a red light. She had watched his knuckles turn white on the steering wheel, had seen the way his jaw clenched when that battered woman crossed the street with 3 infants strapped to her chest. No one important, he had said. But Alfredo Melendez didn't lie well, not to someone who had spent the last year studying every micro-expression, every tell, every crack in his carefully constructed armor. That woman was important. Important enough to shatter his composure. Important enough to make the most feared man in the underworld forget to breathe. And that made her dangerous. Anaya took a slow sip of wine, her reflection sharp and calculating in the floor-to-ceiling windows. She hadn't clawed her way up from nothing, hadn't spent years positioning herself as the perfect strategic alliance, only to be derailed by some ghost from Alfredo's past. The Melendez-Garrett merger was more than a marriage. It was a corporate takeover wrapped in white lace and diamond rings, a carefully orchestrated power play that would consolidate 2 of the city's most powerful criminal enterprises under one ruthless banner. Her banner if she played this correctly. Most people made the mistake of thinking Anaya was just a beautiful accessory, arm candy for a dangerous man. They saw the red dresses and the flawless makeup and assumed she was vapid, harmless. They were fools. Anaya had learned from the best, her father, who had built the Garrett empire from blood and brutal efficiency. He had taught her that sentiment was weakness, that love was a liability, and that power was the only currency that mattered. She set down her wine and pulled up the contact she had been waiting to use. Viktor Sokolov. Former FSB, current freelancer, the kind of man who specialized in problems that needed to disappear. His rates were obscene, but he was worth every penny. Discreet, thorough, and completely amoral. The phone rang twice before his accented voice filled the line. Miss Garrett. It's late. I have a job. High priority, immediate timeline. I need you to locate someone. Of course. Details. Anaya pulled up the photo she had discreetly taken through the Mercedes window, a blurry but serviceable image of the woman from the crosswalk. She had snapped it the moment Alfredo's attention was fixed forward, her instincts screaming that this moment mattered. I'm sending you a photo now. Auburn hair, visible facial bruising, carrying 3 infants. She was last seen entering the East Side tenement district around 9 p.m. I need her full identity, current address, employment history, and any connection she has to Alfredo Melendez. There was a pause, the sound of Victor's keyboard clicking in the background. Melendez. Your fiancé. Yes. This is personal then. Anaya's smile was cold enough to frost the windows. This is business. I'm paying you to find information, not ask questions. Can you deliver or should I call someone else? I can deliver. 48 hours. You have 24. Double your usual rate. She ended the call before he could negotiate further. Money wasn't the issue. Time was. The wedding was 3 months away, and Anaya had learned long ago that loose ends had a way of unraveling carefully laid plans at the worst possible moments. If this woman was connected to Alfredo, if she represented some sentimental attachment that could compromise his focus, then she needed to be handled. Permanently if necessary. Anaya's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Her father. She answered on the second ring, her voice shifting into the carefully modulated tone she used for business. Father. Anaya. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Just reviewing some details for the merger. Not a lie. Everything was about the merger now, every move calculated to strengthen her position before the wedding bells rang. Good. I need you at the estate tomorrow morning. We have things to discuss. The Garrett estate sat on 50 acres of manicured grounds north of the city, a monument to old money and older violence. Anaya's father, Marcus Garrett, had built his empire the traditional way, through intimidation, strategic assassinations, and a complete absence of mercy. He ran his criminal enterprise like a Fortune 500 company, with quarterly projections, hostile takeovers, and a board of advisors who understood that failure meant a shallow grave. Anaya arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, dressed in a steel gray suit that screamed power. She found her father in his study, a room that smelled like Cuban cigars and expensive leather. Marcus was a large man, barrel-chested and silver-haired, with eyes that missed nothing. He gestured for her to sit across from his massive oak desk. "The Melendez merger," he began without preamble. "Where do we stand?" "On schedule. The wedding is in 3 months. Once we're married, the consolidation of territories begins immediately. Alfredo has already agreed to the restructuring terms." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying his daughter with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "And you're certain you can control him? Melendez isn't some corporate yes-man. He's dangerous, unpredictable." Anaya smiled, the expression sharp enough to cut. "That's why this works. Alfredo thinks he's marrying an ally. He sees the strategic value, the combined territories, the unified front against our competitors. What he doesn't see is that I've positioned myself to absorb his entire operation within 2 years." "Explain." "The prenuptial agreement gives me equal say in all business decisions. The restructuring puts half his key lieutenants on my payroll. And once we start having children, the Melendez bloodline becomes legally tied to the Garrett empire. His syndicate becomes our syndicate, all without him realizing he's being swallowed whole." It was a hostile takeover disguised as a love story, and Anaya was rather proud of the elegance. She had studied Alfredo for months, had identified exactly what he needed: legitimacy, expansion, a partner who understood the business. She had made herself indispensable, had positioned the marriage as a merger of equals when in reality, it was an acquisition with a very long timeline. Marcus nodded slowly, approval flickering in his cold eyes. "And what about complications? Men like Melendez always have ghosts in their closet." The woman from the crosswalk flashed through Anaya's mind, that haunted face and those 3 infants. "I'm handling it." "Handling what specifically?" Anaya hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Her father could smell weakness like a shark smelled blood, and admitting she didn't have complete information was dangerous. But lying to Marcus Garrett was even more dangerous. "There may be a former lover. I saw her last night." Alfredo's reaction suggested unfinished business. And I've already hired someone to locate her. Once I have her information, I'll assess the threat level and eliminate it accordingly." Marcus's expression hardened. This is exactly the kind of sentimental garbage that can derail everything. If Melendez has a weakness, if there's some woman he cares about, she becomes leverage. Not just for you but for every enemy we have. You need to handle this immediately and permanently. "I understand." "Do you?" Marcus stood, walking to the window that overlooked his estate. "The Melendez bloodline is valuable because it's feared. Alfredo's reputation, his brutality, his absolute control over his organization, that's what makes this merger worth pursuing. But if he has a soft spot, if there's some woman and possibly children that could be used against him, then we have a problem. Because sentiment makes men weak and weak men lose empires." Anaya joined her father at the window, her mind already racing through scenarios. If the woman was just an ex-lover, she could be bought off or scared away. If there were children involved, things became more complicated. Alfredo might not know about them, might not care, but if he did, if he decided to play the devoted father, it could compromise everything. "I want this resolved before the engagement party next month," Marcus continued. "No surprises, no drama, no skeletons crawling out of closets at inconvenient moments. Find this woman. Assess the situation. And if she represents a threat to the merger, remove her. Quietly. Remove her." The words hung in the air, clinical and final. Anaya had ordered worse, had signed off on eliminations that were far more brutal than whatever would be required here. One desperate woman living in the slums shouldn't be a challenge. And yet, something about Alfredo's reaction nagged at her, the way his entire world had seemed to stop at that red light. "Consider it done," Anaya said, her voice steady. She left the estate with a renewed sense of purpose. The Melendez-Garrett merger was too important, too valuable, to be derailed by sentiment. Alfredo had built his empire on ruthlessness, and Anaya intended to absorb that empire through calculated precision. There was no room for ghosts from the past, no space for inconvenient children or battered ex-lovers who might trigger some dormant sense of guilt. By the time Victor called back 18 hours later, Anaya was ready. She answered on the first ring. "What did you find?" "Aaliyah Carter. 28 years old. Former art student before she dropped out 2 years ago. Currently residing at 847 Hollows Street, apartment 4B. Working 3 jobs: cleaner, laundress and waitress. No criminal record, no family in the area, no support system. And the 3 infants she's carrying? Triplets. Born 18 months ago at County General. No father listed on the birth certificates. No father listed. That was either very convenient or very deliberate. Anaya's mind worked through the implications. If Alfredo was the father, if those children carried his bloodline, then this wasn't just a loose end. This was a direct threat to everything Anaya had planned. Because the Melendez empire would pass to legitimate heirs. And if Alfredo discovered he had 3 children living in poverty, his misplaced sense of honor might compel him to act. "Send me everything you have," Anaya ordered. "Address, work schedules, daily routines. I want to know when she's vulnerable." "Understood. What's the endgame here, Miss Garrett?" Anaya's smile was the cold, calculated expression of a woman who had learned that power required sacrifice. Other people's sacrifice, preferably. "I'm going to make sure the Melendez bloodline remains pure. Through me." She ended the call and stared out at the city lights, already planning her next move. Aaliyah Carter was a problem, but problems had solutions. And Anaya Garrett had built her entire life on being the woman who found those solutions, no matter how permanent they needed to be. The Hollows looked worse in daylight. Alfredo had seen war zones that felt safer than this neighborhood, where broken windows were patched with cardboard and the smell of decay hung in the air like a permanent fog. He had left Mateo and his security detail 3 blocks away, understanding instinctively that showing up with an armed convoy would only make this worse. This conversation, whatever it turned out to be, needed to happen without an audience. 847 Hollows Street was a 5-story tenement that leaned slightly to the left, as if the building itself was exhausted. The front door hung crooked on broken hinges. The stairwell reeked of mold and something chemical that made Alfredo's eyes water. Graffiti covered every available surface, territorial markings from gangs that operated in the building's shadow. Apartment 4B was at the end of a hallway with flickering lights that made the walk feel like descending into hell. Alfredo stood in front of the door, his hand raised to knock, and realized he had no idea what he was going to say. "Sorry" seemed obscenely inadequate. "I didn't know" felt like a coward's excuse. "I'm here to fix this." Assumed he could fix something this broken. He knocked. 3 sharp raps that echoed down the empty hallway. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time. "Aaliyah. It's me. I know you're in there." The silence stretched long enough that Alfredo wondered if she had recognized his voice and simply refused to answer. Then he heard it. The sound of multiple locks disengaging, the scrape of a security chain, the creak of hinges that desperately needed oil. The door opened 6 inches and Aaliyah's face appeared in the gap. Up close, the damage was worse than he had seen through the Mercedes window. The bruise on her cheekbone was a deep purple-black, fresh enough that it probably still hurt to touch. Her auburn hair, which used to shine like burnished copper, hung limp and tangled around her face. But it was her eyes that destroyed him. They were flat, empty, the eyes of someone who had stopped expecting rescue so long ago that hope itself had become a foreign concept. "What do you want, Alfredo?" Her voice was hoarse, worn down by exhaustion and screaming infants and the kind of bone-deep despair that came from fighting a losing battle every single day. There was no surprise in her tone, no shock at seeing him. Just a weary resignation, as if his appearance was simply one more burden on a day already filled with them. "I need to talk to you." "No." She started to close the door, but Alfredo's hand shot out, holding it open. Not forcing, just preventing. "Please. 5 minutes." Aaliyah stared at him for a long moment and Alfredo watched something shift behind her eyes. It wasn't softening. It was harder, colder, the look of someone making a calculation about acceptable risks. Finally, she stepped back and opened the door wider. The apartment was smaller than Alfredo's walk-in closet. One room that served as bedroom, living room, and kitchen, with a bathroom he could see through a partially open door that looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned in decades. The walls were stained with water damage, the ceiling sagging in one corner where a leak had obviously been ignored by whatever slumlord owned this death trap. There was a hot plate on a card table, a mini fridge that hummed ominously, and a single broken-down crib against the far wall. In that crib, pressed together like sardines, were 3 sleeping infants. Leo, Luca, and Lexi, though Alfredo still didn't know their names. They were tiny, impossibly fragile, their faces peaceful in sleep despite the nightmare they had been born into. And even from across the room, even in the dim light filtering through a cracked window, Alfredo could see his own features reflected in their faces. His nose. His jaw. His eyes. Say what you came to say and leave. Aaliyah stood with her arms crossed, positioning herself between Alfredo and the crib like a human shield. She was wearing sweatpants with holes in the knees and a t-shirt that was 2 sizes too big, probably donated. Her feet were bare and Alfredo could see bruises on her ankles too, the kind that came from standing for too many hours on unforgiving floors. I saw you last night, Alfredo started, his voice coming out rougher than intended. At the Crosswalk. I didn't know, Aaliyah. I swear to God I didn't know about them. Something dark and terrible flickered across her face. It wasn't pain. It was rage, the kind that had been compressed under pressure for so long that it had transformed into something diamond-hard and cutting. You didn't know. Of course you didn't know. Because you never bothered to check, did you? You walked away and told yourself it was noble, that you were saving me from your dangerous world, and then you just assumed I'd be fine. I left you money. An offshore account, $2 million. You were supposed to be taken care of. Aaliyah laughed, and it was the most horrible sound Alfredo had ever heard. There was no humor in it, just bitter, broken fury. I never saw a single dollar of your blood money, Alfredo. Not 1 cent. So either you're lying to make yourself feel better or someone in your organization made sure I stayed exactly where they wanted me. Desperate, alone, and too poor to be a problem. The words hit like physical blows. Alfredo had suspected the money was intercepted. Mateo's investigation had all but confirmed it. But hearing it from Aaliyah's mouth made it real in a way that bank records couldn't. I'm going to find out who did this. Great. Fantastic. You solve your internal betrayal problem and meanwhile, I'll just keep working 3 jobs and praying my kids don't starve before I figure out how to pay rent. She took a step toward him and Alfredo saw she was holding something in her right hand, partially concealed behind her thigh. A knife. Not a kitchen knife, but something makeshift and brutal, the kind of weapon people carried when they lived in places where the police didn't come and screaming didn't bring help. Do you want to know what your protection actually looked like, Alfredo? Do you want to hear about the reality of the choice you made? He couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but nod. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after you walked away. I tried to tell you. I showed up at your office building 6 months pregnant with triplets that were crushing my internal organs and your guards threw me out. Literally picked me up and dumped me on the sidewalk like garbage. I tried calling. I tried writing letters. Nothing. Radio silence. So I handled it myself. Aaliyah's voice was steady now, each word precisely enunciated, as if she had practiced this speech in her head 1,000 times. I gave birth to Leo, Luca, and Lexi in a free clinic where the nurses were overworked and the equipment was outdated. Do you know what a triple birth looks like without proper medical care, Alfredo? Do you want to hear about the hemorrhaging, the complications, the fact that Lexi stopped breathing for 43 seconds because the clinic didn't have enough neonatal specialists on staff? Alfredo felt like he was drowning, like someone had wrapped hands around his throat and was squeezing. Aaliyah, I'm not finished. She moved closer, the knife now visible, though she wasn't threatening him with it. It was just there, a reminder of what survival looked like in this neighborhood. They were premature. 18 months old now, and they're still underweight because I can't always afford formula. Luca had an intestinal blockage at 6 months. Emergency surgery. Do you know how I paid for that? I sold the engagement ring you gave me. The one you put on my finger and promised meant forever. I pawned it at a shop that gave me pennies on the dollar and it still wasn't enough. I had to beg the hospital for a payment plan that's going to take me 5 years to pay off. Every word was a knife between his ribs, precise and devastating. Alfredo had built an empire on violence, had ordered deaths without losing sleep, but nothing in his brutal life had prepared him for this. Foreseeing the direct consequences of his cowardice, wearing Aaliyah's exhausted face and sleeping in a broken crib. I work 3 jobs, she continued relentlessly. Midnight to 6 at the wharf, gutting fish and scrubbing blood off concrete floors. 7 to 3 at an industrial laundry where the chemicals are probably giving me cancer. 4 to midnight on weekends at a diner where the owner pays under the table and takes liberties he shouldn't. She gestured to the bruise on her face, and Alfredo's hands clenched into fists hard enough that his knuckles cracked. This is from telling him no. He'll fire me eventually and I'll find another job that treats me like garbage because that's what happens when you're desperate and alone and have 3 mouths to feed. Aaliyah, please let me. Let you what? Fix it? Make it better? You think you can just show up after 2 years and wave your magic crime lord wand and suddenly everything's okay? It's not okay, Alfredo. It's never going to be okay. You didn't save me from your world. You threw me into something infinitely worse and you did it while telling yourself you were being noble. He was right. Every word was true and the truth was so ugly that Alfredo wanted to put his fists through the stained wall. He had told himself that walking away was a sacrifice, that cutting Aaliyah loose protected her from his enemies, from the violence that followed him like a shadow. But nobility didn't leave 3 infants sleeping in a single crib in a tenement where gunshots were lullabies. Sacrifice didn't put bruises on the face of the woman he had loved more than life itself. His greatest act of cowardice was calling it love when he walked away. Alfredo looked at the crib again, at the 3 tiny lives he had helped create and then abandoned to suffer. Leo, or maybe it was Luca, shifted in his sleep, making a small sound that went straight through Alfredo's chest. These were his children. His blood. His responsibility. And they were living in conditions that made prison look comfortable. I'm sorry. The words were pathetically inadequate, but they were all he had. I'm so sorry, Aaliyah. Thought I was protecting you. I thought walking away was the right thing to do. I was wrong. I was so catastrophically wrong and I don't know how to fix it, but I need you to let me try. Aaliyah stared at him for a long moment and Alfredo watched something in her expression crack, just slightly. Not forgiveness. She was nowhere near forgiveness. But maybe, possibly, the tiniest opening toward believing he was sincere. You can't fix this, she said finally, her voice quieter now, worn down by exhaustion and 2 years of fighting alone. You can throw money at it, sure. You can get us out of this apartment, buy food and diapers and everything we need. But you can't fix the fact that I went through hell alone. You can't give me back the nights I spent wondering if my babies would survive until morning. You can't erase the fact that when I needed you most, you weren't there. I know. And he did. Alfredo understood that some damage was permanent, that some betrayals left scars no amount of money or power could heal. But standing in this cramped apartment, looking at the evidence of his failure sleeping peacefully in a broken crib, he made a decision. But I'm here now. And I'm not walking away again. Alfredo left Aaliyah's apartment with a promise he wasn't sure he could keep and a rage that threatened to consume him from the inside out. He had offered money, protection, everything he could think of, and she had stared at him with those flat, exhausted eyes and told him she would think about it. Not yes. Not forgiveness. Just the cold acknowledgement that she would consider whether allowing him back into her life would cause more damage than his absence already had. By the time he reached the street where Mateo and his security detail waited, Alfredo's fury had crystallized into something cold and surgical. Someone in his organization had intercepted his safeguards, had stolen from Aaliyah, had turned his protection into abandonment. And the list of people with enough access to pull that off was very, very short. He slid into the back of the Mercedes without a word. Mateo was in the passenger seat, his expression carefully neutral in that way that had always meant he was reading the room, calculating variables. How did it go? Alfredo didn't answer immediately. He was too busy replaying Aaliyah's words, the detail that had been eating at him since she said it. Your guards threw me out. Literally picked me up and dumped me on the sidewalk. He had never given that order. He had walked away from Aaliyah, yes, but he had never told his security to treat her like a threat. Pull up the security roster from 2 years ago, Alfredo said, his voice dangerously quiet. I want the names of everyone who was working the office building the day Aaliyah came looking for me. She said she was 6 months pregnant at the time, so that narrows it down. Late spring, early summer. Mateo's fingers hesitated over his phone for just a fraction of a second. It was barely noticeable, the kind of tell that most people would miss. But Alfredo had spent 15 years working alongside this man, had learned to read every micro-expression, every pause. That hesitation meant something. Of course. Any particular reason? Because she told me your guards threw her out like garbage when she was carrying my children and I never gave that order. So either my security detail has been making executive decisions without my approval, or someone told them Aaliyah Carter was a threat that needed to be handled. The silence in the car was suffocating. Through the rearview mirror, Alfredo watched Mateo's jaw tighten, watched him school his features back into careful neutrality. The underboss was good, had always been good at hiding his thoughts, but Alfredo knew him too well. Something was wrong. I'll pull the records, Matteo said finally. Do it now. They drove back to the waterfront office in silence thick enough to choke on. Alfredo's mind was racing through possibilities, through the logistics of who had access to what, who knew about Aaliyah, who could have intercepted the offshore account and the letters and the protection he thought he had put in place. The list kept coming back to the same name over and over like a drumbeat he didn't want to hear. Matteo Reyes. His underboss. His right hand. The man he had trusted with his life for 15 years. Back in his office, Alfredo didn't sit down. He stood by the window overlooking the harbor, his back to Matteo, his entire body coiled like a spring ready to snap. The security roster. Now. He heard the click of a laptop opening, the tap of keys. Then Matteo's voice, carefully measured. Late spring 2 years ago. The guards on duty at the main office were Rodriguez, Chin, and Volkov. Do you want me to bring them in for questioning? Yes. All three. Tonight. Rodriguez arrived first, a stocky man in his 40s who had been with the organization for a decade. He walked into Alfredo's office with the easy confidence of someone who thought this was routine, just another briefing. That confidence evaporated the moment he saw Alfredo's expression. Sir. 2 years ago, late spring. A woman came to the office looking for me. Auburn hair, 6 months pregnant. Do you remember her? Rodriguez's eyes went wide, then darted to Matteo, who stood in the corner with his arms crossed. The underboss's face was unreadable, but something in his posture must have communicated a message because Rodriguez's entire body language shifted. He was scared. Not of Alfredo. Yes, sir. I remember. What happened? We were told she was a security risk. That she was trying to use a past relationship with you to gain access to sensitive areas. We followed protocol for unauthorized civilians. Alfredo's voice dropped to a whisper, which was somehow more terrifying than shouting. What protocol specifically? We escorted her out of the building. Physically, when she refused to leave voluntarily. Who gave you that order? Rodriguez's gaze flickered to Matteo again, and this time Alfredo caught it. The piece that had been nagging at him since Aaliyah's apartment, the suspicion that had been growing like poison in his gut, suddenly crystallized into certainty. I asked you a question, Rodriguez. Who gave you the order to remove Aaliyah Carter from the building? The guard swallowed hard. Matteo, sir. He said it came from you, that you wanted her gone and didn't want to be bothered with the details. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Alfredo didn't move, didn't react, just kept staring at Rodriguez with an expression that made the guard take an involuntary step backward. Get out. Rodriguez practically ran from the office. The moment the door closed, Alfredo turned to face Matteo. His underboss hadn't moved, hadn't even shifted his weight. He stood there with the calm resignation of someone who had been expecting this confrontation and had already made peace with whatever came next. It was you. Not a question. A statement of fact, cold and final. Matteo met his gaze without flinching. Yes. The admission was somehow worse than denial would have been. Alfredo had been half hoping he was wrong, that there was some explanation that made sense, that his oldest friend and most trusted lieutenant hadn't systematically destroyed the life of the woman he loved. But Matteo wasn't even trying to lie, wasn't attempting to weasel out of it. Why? Because she made you weak. Matteo's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he was explaining a simple business decision. Aaliyah Carter was a civilian, Alfredo. She had no place in this world, no understanding of what we do or why we do it. And you were in love with her, which meant she was a liability. Enemies could use her against you. Rivals could target her to hurt you. She was a weakness we couldn't afford. So you decided to remove her. I decided to solve a problem before it became catastrophic. You were already talking about getting out, about building a legitimate life with her. Do you have any idea how dangerous that was? The moment you go soft, the moment you show vulnerability, every organization in this city smells blood. We would have been torn apart. Alfredo's hands were shaking with the effort of not putting them around Matteo's throat. The offshore account. The letters. You intercepted everything. I rerouted the money through Melendez Holdings and used it to fund a side operation with the Kozlov Syndicate. They were consolidating power in the Eastern Territories, and I saw an opportunity to position us as their primary partners. The investment has already paid off 3 times over. You're welcome. The casual way he said it, as if embezzling $2 million and leaving Aaliyah destitute was just smart business, made Alfredo's vision blur red. You stole from her. You threw her out of my building when she was pregnant with my children. You intercepted every attempt I made to protect her, and you did it all while standing next to me and pretending to be loyal. I was loyal, Mateo said, and there was genuine conviction in his voice. Everything I did was for the syndicate, for the empire we built together. Your love for Aaliyah Carter was a threat to that empire. I neutralized the threat. That's my job. Your job is to follow my orders, not make unilateral decisions about my personal life. Your personal life affects the organization. You taught me that. You taught me that sentiment is weakness, that we can't afford attachments, that power requires sacrifice. I was following your philosophy, Alfredo. I was being the soldier you trained me to be. There was a twisted logic to it that made Alfredo want to scream. Mateo wasn't entirely wrong. He had built the Melendez syndicate on those principles. Ruthlessness, calculated decisions, the elimination of weakness. He had taught his people to prioritize the organization above everything else, to view personal attachments as liabilities. And Mateo had taken those lessons and applied them to the one thing Alfredo thought was sacred. Where is she now? Alfredo asked, forcing his voice to stay level. Aaliyah. Is she in danger from the Kozlov syndicate? Mateo's expression shifted just slightly. It was the first crack in his composure, a flicker of something that might have been concern. The Kozlovs know about her. I had to provide information to seal the deal, proof that I had removed your primary vulnerability. They're aware that Aaliyah Carter was important to you, and they're aware that she has children. Whether they've decided to do anything about it, I don't know. Viktor Kozlov plays a long game. Ice flooded Alfredo's veins. Viktor Kozlov was the head of the Russian syndicate operating in the Eastern Territories, a man known for patience, strategic thinking, and a complete absence of mercy. If Viktor knew about Aaliyah and the triplets, if he had decided they represented an opportunity, then they were in danger that went far beyond poverty and exhaustion. You put a target on her back. Alfredo's voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of absolute fury. You removed my protections, stole the money that was supposed to keep her safe, and then you told our enemies exactly where to find her vulnerability. I told them she was no longer a vulnerability because she was no longer in your life. But if the Kozlovs have been watching her, if they've seen you tracking her down now, then yes, they might reassess. They might decide that Aaliyah Carter and those children are leverage after all. Alfredo wanted to kill him. Every instinct screamed to put a bullet between Mateo's eyes and watch the man who had betrayed him bleed out on his expensive carpet. But killing Mateo now would be stupid, would be the kind of emotional decision that got people killed. Because if the Kozlovs were circling Aaliyah, if they were positioning themselves to use her as leverage against the Melendez syndicate, then Alfredo needed information. He needed to know their plans, their timeline, their vulnerabilities. And the only person who could get him that information was standing right in front of him, wearing the face of loyalty while hiding a traitor's heart. You're going to fix this, Alfredo said, each word precise and cold. You're going to contact Viktor Kozlov and find out exactly what he knows about Aaliyah and my children. You're going to discover if he has plans to move against them. And you're going to do it without alerting him that I'm asking, without giving him any indication that she matters to me. Can you do that? Mateo nodded slowly. Yes. Good. Because if anything happens to Aaliyah or those children, if Viktor Kozlov or anyone else touches them because of information you provided, I will make you beg for death. Do you understand me? I understand. Get out of my sight. Mateo left without another word, and Alfredo was alone in his office with the wreckage of 15 years of friendship and the cold certainty that nothing would ever be the same. His underboss had betrayed him, had stolen from Aaliyah, had endangered his children, all while claiming it was for the good of the organization. And now Alfredo had to play a careful game, had to keep Mateo close enough to be useful while planning exactly how he was going to dismantle the man's life piece by piece. But first he had to protect Aaliyah. Because if the Kozlovs were watching her, if they had decided that 3 infants and an exhausted woman represented an opportunity to hurt the Melendez syndicate, then the danger she faced went far beyond a brutal boss at a diner and an apartment that might collapse in a strong wind. The snake in the grass had revealed himself. Now Alfredo had to decide how to kill it without letting the venom spread. Alfredo didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office with the lights off, staring at the harbor through bulletproof glass, his mind running through scenarios like a chess master calculating moves 20 steps ahead. Mateo was compromised, the Kozlovs were circling, and Aaliyah was living in a tenement with security measures that consisted of cheap locks and prayers. Every instinct screamed at him to move her immediately, to pull her and the triplets out of that death trap and put them somewhere safe. But safe was a relative term in his world, and making the wrong move now could get them all killed. His encrypted phone buzzed at 3 a.m. Unknown number. Alfredo almost ignored it, his patience for games worn down to nothing, but something made him answer. Yes. Alfredo Melendez. It's been too long. The voice was smooth, cultured, with the faint trace of a British accent that had been softened by years in America. Alfredo recognized it immediately and his entire body went rigid. Silas Vane. The North Side kingpin, a man who controlled everything from the docks to the financial district with an iron fist wrapped in expensive suits and polite conversation. Alfredo grabbed his car keys and was out the door before he could second-guess the decision. Matteo could wait. The investigation into who drained the offshore account could wait. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting to Aaliyah before someone else did. He made the drive to the Hollows in record time, his Mercedes eating up the streets while his security detail scrambled to follow. When he reached 847 Hollows Street, he saw it immediately. A single red rose lying on the filthy hallway floor outside apartment 4B, tied with a black ribbon. Next to it, gleaming dully in the flickering hallway light, was a 9mm bullet. Alfredo picked up both items with hands that wanted to shake but didn't. The message was clear, professional, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Silas Vane had people who could walk right up to Aaliyah's door, could leave a calling card that screamed threat, and could disappear without anyone noticing. Which meant he could come back. Could send someone less interested in warnings and more interested in permanent solutions. He knocked on the door harder than he meant to, his composure fraying at the edges. Aaliyah. It's Alfredo. Open the door. Now. He heard movement inside, the shuffle of exhausted feet, the sound of locks disengaging. The door opened and Aaliyah stood there in the same oversized t-shirt from earlier, her hair tangled from sleep, her eyes struggling to focus. Then she saw the rose and bullet in his hands, and whatever exhaustion had been clouding her expression vanished, replaced by sharp, immediate fear. What is that? A message. From someone who knows where you live and wants to make sure we both understand how vulnerable you are. Alfredo pushed past her into the apartment, his eyes immediately going to the crib where the triplets were still sleeping, blissfully unaware that their existence had just become a weapon in a war they didn't know was being fought. You need to pack. No. Whatever you and the children need for a few days. We're leaving. Leaving? Alfredo, what are you talking about? There's a man named Silas Vane. He's a rival, one of the most dangerous people in this city, and he's decided that you and the triplets are his leverage against me. He left this on your doorstep tonight, which means he has people watching this building. We need to move you somewhere safe before he decides a rose and a bullet aren't enough. Aaliyah stared at him, and Alfredo watched the horror dawn in her eyes as she realized what he was saying. Her children weren't just living in poverty. They were living in a war zone and they had just been marked as targets. Safe where? I don't have anywhere else to go. My estate. It's the only place with enough security to keep you protected. Your estate. Her voice was flat, disbelieving. The one where your fiancé lives? Where your entire organization operates? You want me to bring your children to the heart of the world you swore was too dangerous for me? The irony wasn't lost on Alfredo. He had walked away 2 years ago claiming he was protecting Aaliyah from his world. And now he was dragging her directly into it because leaving her outside had proven infinitely more dangerous. I don't have another option. Anaya doesn't live at the estate, she has her own penthouse. And yes, bringing you there will alert the organization, will raise questions I'm not ready to answer. But the alternative is leaving you here where Silas Vane can get to you anytime he wants. Aaliyah looked at the crib, at her 3 sleeping children, and Alfredo saw the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was weighing risks, trying to determine which danger was greater. Staying in this apartment where threats could appear at her doorstep, or entering Alfredo's world where different but equally lethal dangers waited. If I do this, she said finally, her voice shaking with barely controlled fear, if I bring them to your estate, you need to understand something. I'm not doing it because I forgive you. I'm not doing it because I trust you. I'm doing it because you're telling me my children are in danger. And I will do whatever it takes to keep them safe. Even if that means walking into hell itself. I understand. And if anything happens to them, if your world touches them in any way, I will make you regret the day you ever walked into my life. Are we clear? Alfredo met her gaze, saw the fierce, protective love of a mother who had already been through hell and would gladly go through it again if it meant protecting her babies. Crystal clear. Now pack. We're leaving in 5 minutes. The drive to the Melendez estate was silent except for the soft sounds of 3 infants who had been woken too early and were unsure whether to cry or sleep. Aaliyah sat in the back of the Mercedes with the triplets strapped into car seats that Alfredo's security team had somehow procured in less than 10 minutes, her face pressed against the window, watching the city transform from decay to prosperity as they left the Hollows behind. Alfredo watched her through the rearview mirror, watched the way her hands kept reaching out to touch the car seats, as if she needed constant physical confirmation that her children were still there, still safe. She hadn't said a word since they left the apartment, had just packed a single duffel bag with practiced efficiency and gathered the babies with the mechanical precision of someone operating on pure survival instinct. He had told her about Silas Vane during those frantic minutes of packing. Had explained, in clipped sentences that couldn't hide the urgency, that she and the children were leveraged now, that the Northside kingpin intended to use them to delegitimize Alfredo's claim to power at the commission meeting. He had watched her face go pale, watched her hands shake as she realized that poverty and exhaustion weren't the worst things her children would face. "I hate you," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper as she zipped the duffel bag. "I hate you for walking away, and I hate you for coming back, and I hate that the only reason my children might survive is because you finally decided they mattered." Alfredo hadn't argued. There was nothing to argue. He was right. But she had agreed to come. Despite the hatred burning in her eyes, despite the years of suffering and abandonment, she had looked at her sleeping children and made the calculation that every parent made when faced with impossible choices. Their survival mattered more than her pride. The Melendez estate sat on 20 acres of carefully manicured grounds, surrounded by walls that were designed to look decorative but were actually reinforced steel topped with surveillance systems that could detect a fly landing wrong. The main house was a sprawling Mediterranean-style villa that screamed old money and older violence, with enough rooms to house a small army and enough security to repel an actual one. As the Mercedes pulled through the gates, Alfredo saw the lights were on in the foyer, which meant someone was awake. Which meant someone had been alerted to his late-night arrival with unexpected guests. Which meant Anaya knew. He parked in front of the main entrance, and the moment he opened the car door he saw her. Anaya Garrett stood in the doorway like a sentinel, backlit by the chandelier in the foyer, wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than Aaliyah's rent for a year. Her expression was carefully composed, but Alfredo could see the fury simmering beneath the surface, could read the tight line of her jaw and the rigid set of her shoulders. This was going to be bad. Alfredo opened the back door and began unstrapping the first car seat. Leo or maybe Luca, he still couldn't tell them apart in the dark. The infant stirred but didn't wake, his tiny face peaceful despite being moved from the only home he had ever known. Aaliyah was already out of the car, reaching for the other two car seats with movements that were protective and possessive. They walked toward the entrance together, and Alfredo saw the exact moment Anaya's gaze shifted from him to Aaliyah, then down to the three infants. Her expression didn't change, but something cold and calculating flickered behind her eyes, the look of someone rapidly reassessing a situation she thought she had under control. "Alfredo." Anaya's voice was pleasant, almost warm, which made it infinitely more dangerous. "You didn't mention you were bringing guests. And at such an unusual hour. It's a security matter. They need protection, and the estate is the safest location." He carried the car seat past her into the foyer, not waiting for permission or approval. This was his house, his decision, and he wasn't going to negotiate it. Anaya's gaze locked onto Aaliyah, who stood in the doorway holding two car seats with the posture of someone ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. The two women stared at each other, and Alfredo watched a silent war play out in the space between them. Anaya, immaculate and powerful in her silk robe, representing everything the criminal elite aspired to be. Aaliyah, exhausted and battered in donated clothes, representing everything that world destroyed. "So this is her." Anaya's voice was soft, almost conversational, as she circled Aaliyah like a predator evaluating prey. "The woman from the Crosswalk. The homeless woman you claimed was no one important." "She's not homeless," Alfredo said, his voice hard. "And she's under my protection now. That's all you need to know." "Is it?" Anaya moved closer to Aaliyah, and Alfredo saw his fiancée's eyes drop to the three car seats with an expression that mixed disgust and calculation. "3 children. How convenient. And they look about, 18 months old. The timeline is interesting, don't you think?" Aaliyah's hands tightened on the car seat handles. "I don't know who you are, but these children are tired and I need to put them somewhere safe. So either help or get out of the way." The directness of it seemed to surprise Anaya. She was used to people cowering, to the Garrett name carrying weight that made others step carefully. But Aaliyah wasn't part of that world, didn't understand or care about the power dynamics at play. She was a mother protecting her children, and everything else was secondary. "I'm Anaya Garrett. Alfredo's fiancée." The woman who will be his wife in 3 months, who will bear his legitimate heirs, who will stand beside him as the head of this organization. Each word was precisely enunciated, designed to cut, to establish dominance. And you are Aaliyah Carter. The woman who raised his children alone while you played dress-up in penthouses and planned weddings. The slap came so fast that Alfredo almost didn't react in time. Anaya's hand was already moving toward Aaliyah's face when he caught her wrist, his grip iron hard enough to make her gasp. Don't. Let go of me, Alfredo. Not until you understand that she and the children are under my protection. Which means no one touches them. Not you, not your father, not anyone. Are we clear? Anaya wrenched her wrist free, her eyes blazing with fury that she no longer bothered to hide. You bring your bastards into our home, you humiliate me in front of your security team, and you expect me to just accept this? Do you have any idea what this looks like? What the other families will say when they find out the great Alfredo Melendez has children living in poverty while he plans a wedding? They already know. Silas Vane made sure of it. Which is why Aaliyah and the children are here, because leaving them in that apartment was a death sentence. Alfredo set down the car seat and turned to face Anaya fully. I don't have time for your wounded pride right now. There's a threat and I'm addressing it. You can either help or you can leave. Leave? This is my estate too. Or did you forget that little detail when you decided to install your ex-lover and her children in the guest wing? It's my estate. Your name isn't on the deed and it won't be until we're married. So right now this is my house and these are my guests and you will treat them with respect or you will leave. Choose. The silence that followed was thick enough to suffocate. Anaya stared at Alfredo with an expression that promised this conversation was far from over, that there would be consequences for this public humiliation. But she was smart enough to recognize when she had lost a battle, smart enough to know that pushing this right now would only weaken her position further. Fine. The word was clipped cold. I'll be in my quarters if you need me. Though I suspect you'll be too busy playing house with your new family. She turned and walked away, her silk robe billowing behind her like a cape, every line of her body radiating fury. Alfredo watched her go and felt the fragile alliance he had built with the Garrett family begin to crack. This was going to have consequences, political ramifications that would ripple through both organizations. But standing in his foyer with 3 infants who carried his blood and a woman who had suffered because of his choices, he found he didn't care. Aaliyah had remained silent through the entire confrontation, but now she looked at Alfredo with something that might have been the tiniest grudging respect. Your fiancée seems lovely. She's a strategic alliance, not a love match. How romantic. Aaliyah adjusted her grip on the car seats. Where can I put the children down? They need to sleep. Alfredo led her through the mansion, through hallways lined with artwork that cost more than most people made in a lifetime, past rooms filled with furniture that existed purely for show. He took her to the guest wing, to a suite that was larger than her entire apartment had been, with a bedroom, sitting room and bathroom that looked like something from a luxury hotel. This is temporary, Aaliyah said, setting down the car seats with visible relief. Just until this Silas Vane situation is resolved. Then we're gone. Aaliyah. No. She held up a hand, cutting him off. I agreed to come here for their safety. That's it. This isn't reconciliation, this isn't forgiveness, and this definitely isn't some second chance at whatever we had. Once the danger passes, we're leaving and you can go back to your fiancé and your empire and your life of calculated violence. Alfredo wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that now that he knew about the children, now that he had seen what his abandonment had cost them, leaving wasn't an option. But pushing that conversation now, when she was exhausted and scared and operating on pure adrenaline, would only make things worse. One of the infants started crying, a thin, tired wail that seemed to activate something in Aaliyah. She moved immediately to the car seat, unbuckling the straps with practiced efficiency and lifting out a tiny body that seemed impossibly fragile. Shulexi. It's okay, baby. We're safe now. His daughter. Alfredo stood frozen as Aaliyah rocked the infant, whispering soft reassurances that gradually calmed the crying. He had imagined this moment during the drive, had tried to prepare himself for the reality of meeting his children. But nothing could have prepared him for the actual sight of his daughter, barely bigger than a football, her face scrunched up in exhaustion and confusion. Do you want to hold her? Aaliyah's voice was soft, lacking the sharp edge it had carried since he showed up at her apartment. She's not going to bite. Alfredo's hands were shaking as he reached out. Aaliyah transferred Lexi into his arms with movements that suggested she was trusting him with something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. The infant weighed almost nothing, her entire body fitting in the crook of his elbow, her eyes squinting up at him with an expression that was somehow both suspicious and curious. "Support her head," Aaliyah instructed. "And don't look so terrified. She can smell fear." Alfredo adjusted his hold, cradling Lexi against his chest, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. This wasn't abstract anymore, wasn't just a concept or a responsibility. This was his daughter, flesh and blood, a tiny human who shared his DNA and depended on him for survival. Her eyes were dark, just like his, and when she yawned, he saw the beginning of a smile that made his chest tighten. The other two infants were stirring now, their soft sounds filling the quiet room. Aaliyah moved to comfort them, lifting them from their car seats with the exhausted efficiency of a mother who had been doing this alone for too long. Leo and Luca, though Alfredo still couldn't tell which was which. "This one is Leo," Aaliyah said as if reading his mind. She held up the infant in her left arm. "He has a small birthmark behind his left ear. And this is Luca. He's got your stubborn chin." His sons. Alfredo stared at the three tiny lives that had been created from a love he thought he was protecting, and felt the weight of fatherhood crash over him like a wave. These weren't political pieces, weren't leverage in a power game. They were children. His children. And for the first time in his adult life, the Mafia instincts that had kept him alive for 20 years seemed secondary to something far more primal. "I'm going to keep you safe," he whispered to Lexi, who had fallen back asleep in his arms. "All of you. I swear it." Aaliyah watched him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Promises are easy, Alfredo. It's the follow-through that matters. And your track record isn't exactly inspiring confidence." She was right, and they both knew it. But as Alfredo stood in that guest suite, holding his daughter for the first time while his sons slept in their mother's arms, he made a decision that he knew would change everything. The syndicate, the territories, the carefully constructed empire he had built, all of it was secondary now. Because he had found something worth protecting that didn't involve violence or calculated power plays. He had found his family. And he would burn the entire underworld to the ground before he let anyone hurt them again. 3 days at the estate had been enough to establish a routine, fragile as glass but functional. Aaliyah stayed in the guest wing with the triplets, venturing out only for meals that were eaten in tense silence while Anaya watched from across the table with barely concealed hostility. Alfredo spent his days coordinating security, tracking Silas Vane's movements, and trying to identify the leak in his organization that had allowed the Northside kingpin to get so close to his family. But the estate, for all its fortifications, was too visible. Too many people knew Aaliyah, and the children were there now. Security staff, household employees, and worst of all, Anaya, who had made no secret of her fury at the situation. Alfredo had spent 2 sleepless nights calculating risk factors and had come to an unavoidable conclusion. They needed to move to a secondary location, somewhere unknown even to most of his organization. He had a safe house in the industrial district, a reinforced warehouse that had been converted into living quarters for exactly this kind of emergency. Only 3 people knew about it: Alfredo, his head of security, and Mateo. He had excluded Mateo from the planning this time, had worked directly with his security chief to coordinate the move. But the warehouse location was already in the system, already logged in encrypted files that Mateo would have had access to years ago. Alfredo pushed the concern aside. They would move quickly, change the route at the last minute, keep the convoy small and mobile. Standard protocol for high-risk extraction. They left the estate at dawn when the city was still caught between night and morning. 2 armored Mercedes sedans and a black SUV. Enough firepower to handle most threats but small enough to move quickly. Aaliyah sat in the back of the lead Mercedes with Alfredo, the triplets strapped into their car seats between them. She hadn't asked questions about where they were going, had just dressed the babies and packed their minimal belongings with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had learned not to expect stability. "How long will we be at this new place?" she asked as the convoy pulled through the estate gates. "Until I've eliminated the threat." Alfredo was scanning the streets through tinted windows, his instincts screaming that something was wrong even though he couldn't identify what. The city looked normal, morning traffic beginning to build, pedestrians hurrying to work with their heads down and coffee cups clutched like lifelines. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. The route Alfredo had chosen took them through the financial district, then east toward the industrial zone. It avoided the hollows entirely, skirted the territories controlled by the other families, and used main thoroughfares where an ambush would be difficult to execute without massive civilian casualties. Silas Vane was ruthless, but he was also smart. Triggering a bloodbath in broad daylight would bring law enforcement attention that none of them could afford. They were 15 minutes into the drive when Alfredo saw it. The intersection ahead, the traffic light turning red, the crosswalk filling with morning commuters. Recognition slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. This was the intersection. The exact spot where he had first seen Aaliyah 3 days ago, where his carefully constructed world had shattered at the sight of red hair and 3 infants. The coincidence was too perfect, too deliberate. Stop the car. His voice was sharp, urgent, but the driver was already slowing for the red light, following traffic patterns that would seem suspicious if they didn't. I said stop. The driver hit the brakes, but it was too late. The motorcade was already in the intersection, the light above them shifting from yellow to red, and Alfredo's tactical mind was screaming warnings that his body couldn't act on fast enough. The first shot came from a rooftop to the east, a high-powered rifle that punched through the windshield of the trailing SUV and took out the driver. The vehicle swerved wildly, crashing into a parked car with a sound like thunder. Then the world exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from 3 different directions simultaneously. The storefronts that had looked empty suddenly disgorged armed men wearing civilian clothes and carrying military-grade weapons. Pedestrians scattered, screaming, diving for cover as bullets tore through the morning air. The armored Mercedes took hits that sounded like metal rain, the bulletproof glass spiderwebbing but holding. Get down. Alfredo threw himself over Aaliyah and the triplets, his body covering the car seats as best he could. The infants were screaming now, high-pitched wails of terror that cut through the gunfire. Aaliyah was trying to shield them with her arms, her face pressed against Leo's car seat, her entire body trembling. This was an execution, not a warning. Silas Vane had set a trap at the exact intersection where Alfredo's weakness had been revealed, and now he was trying to eliminate that weakness permanently. The symbolism wasn't lost on Alfredo. This was a message to the entire underworld. Alfredo Melendez cannot protect his own blood. The driver was screaming into his radio calling for backup, but backup was minutes away and they had seconds. Alfredo could hear the distinctive sound of men advancing, could see through the spider-webbed glass that they were surrounding the vehicle with tactical precision. Professional mercenaries, not street thugs. Silas had hired the best. Sir, we need to move. The driver had his weapon out, was trying to provide cover fire through the damaged windshield, but there were too many attackers. We're sitting ducks here. Alfredo's mind raced through options with the cold calculation that had kept him alive for 20 years. They couldn't stay in the vehicle. The armor would only hold for so long, and once the mercenaries brought out armor-piercing rounds or explosives, they were dead. They couldn't retreat back toward the estate because the route was now compromised. And they couldn't wait for backup because Aaliyah and the triplets would be dead before help arrived. Which left one option. The option that every tactical manual said was suicide but that Alfredo's instincts knew was their only chance. When I open the door, you drive forward. Don't stop, don't look back. Get to the safe house and wait for my signal. Alfredo was already moving, checking his weapon, releasing the safety. Aaliyah, when I say run, you grab the carrier and you run. Don't look at me, don't hesitate, just get to that building. He pointed to a bank on the corner, heavy doors that would provide temporary shelter. You understand? Alfredo, no. You can't. Do you understand? Her eyes were wide with terror, but she nodded. Alfredo reached across her to unbuckle the center car seat, the triple carrier that held all 3 infants, and pulled it toward him. The babies were still screaming, their faces red with fear and confusion. He met Aaliyah's gaze one more time, saw the pleading there, the desperate hope that he had some brilliant plan that didn't involve sacrifice. He didn't. This was going to be ugly, brutal, and probably fatal. But if it bought Aaliyah and the children 30 seconds to reach cover, it would be worth it. On 3. 2. 3. Alfredo kicked open the door and stepped into hell. The morning air was thick with gunpowder and screams. Bullets immediately tracked toward him. mercenaries adjusting their aim from the vehicle to the man who had just made himself the biggest target in the intersection. Alfredo moved with the triple carrier held against his chest, using his own body as a shield, placing himself between the gunfire and the three infants who were screaming in his arms. He fired as he moved, double taps that dropped two mercenaries before they could adjust. Behind him he could hear Aaliyah scrambling out of the vehicle, could hear the Mercedes peeling away as the driver followed orders. The world narrowed to bullets and movement and the desperate calculus of which direction offered the most cover. The pavement exploded in front of him, concrete chips cutting his face. Alfredo zigzagged, keeping his body between the shooters and the carrier, his weapon barking as he laid down suppressing fire. One of the mercenaries got close, too close, and Alfredo put 3 rounds center mass without breaking stride. The man went down and Alfredo kept moving. He could see Aaliyah running toward the bank, her arms pumping, her face a mask of terror. Good. She was fast, faster than he expected, driven by pure maternal desperation. 10 more feet. She reached the heavy doors and disappeared inside just as Alfredo felt the impact. The bullet hit his left shoulder, punching through muscle and spinning him halfway around. He didn't feel pain, not yet, just the hot pressure of impact and the knowledge that he had maybe seconds before shock set in. The triple carrier was still clutched against his chest, the 3 infants screaming but alive, and Alfredo forced his legs to keep moving even as blood soaked through his shirt. The bank doors. He could see them now, could see Aaliyah's face pressed against the glass, her hands pounding on the door to open it for him. Another bullet hit the carrier, lodging in the reinforced frame inches from Luca's head, and Alfredo felt rage explode through the shock. These weren't soldiers attacking soldiers. These were mercenaries shooting at infants, and that crossed a line that even the underworld respected. Alfredo made it to the doors and practically threw the carrier at Aaliyah, who caught it with a sob of relief. He spun, putting his back against the heavy doors, and opened fire with the last of his ammunition. Methodical, precise, the kind of shooting that came from years of training and a complete absence of mercy. 4 more mercenaries went down, and suddenly the survivors were retreating, melting back into the storefronts and alleys they had emerged from. The entire ambush had lasted less than 2 minutes. Alfredo slumped against the doors, his shoulder on fire now, blood running down his arm in rivers. Through the ringing in his ears he could hear sirens approaching. Police. The one thing everyone in the underworld wanted to avoid. He looked through the glass at Aaliyah, who was crouched over the triplets, checking them frantically for injuries. Are they hurt? His voice sounded strange to his own ears, distant and strained. No. They're terrified but they're not hurt. Aaliyah's hands were shaking as she unbuckled them from the carrier, holding them close. You're bleeding. I'll live. Probably. The shoulder wound was bad but not immediately fatal. He had survived worse. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Alfredo pulled it out with his good hand, leaving bloody fingerprints on the screen. A text message from an unknown number. Impressive. But you can't shield them forever. SV. Silas Vane. Watching from somewhere, probably reviewing footage of the ambush, analyzing Alfredo's response time and defensive tactics. The message was clear. This was just the opening move. The real game was still ahead. But what chilled Alfredo to the bone wasn't the threat. It was the tactical precision of the attack. The mercenaries had known exactly which route the convoy would take, had known the timing precise enough to set up an ambush at that specific intersection. The coordinates hadn't just leaked. They had been provided. Someone in his organization, someone with access to his security protocols and movement plans, had given Silas Vane everything he needed to execute this attack. And that meant the mole wasn't just stealing money or intercepting letters anymore. They were actively trying to get Alfredo and his family killed. The motorcade pulled up outside the bank, 3 fresh vehicles with enough firepower to level a city block. Alfredo's head of security, a grizzled veteran named Marcus, practically carried him to the nearest SUV. Hospital. Now. No hospital. Take us to the backup safe house. The one only you and I know about. Alfredo's vision was starting to blur, shock finally catching up to adrenaline. And Marcus? Find out who had access to this morning's route plan. I want names in 2 hours. Sir, you're bleeding out. 2 hours, Marcus. That's an order. He looked back through the bank windows one more time, saw Aaliyah holding the triplets against her chest, her face pale with shock but her eyes meeting his with an expression he couldn't quite read. Furious. Anger, absolutely. But underneath it all, maybe, possibly, the tiniest fraction of gratitude that he had kept his word. He had promised to keep them safe. And even with a bullet in his shoulder and a traitor in his organization, he had delivered. Barely. But barely was all that mattered in their world. The difference between life and death was often measured in inches and seconds, and today they had survived by both. The question was whether they would survive tomorrow and the day after that, and all the tomorrows that would come as long as Silas Vane saw them as leverage and someone in Alfredo's organization kept feeding him information. The mole was confirmed. Now Alfredo just had to find them before they succeeded in finishing what today's ambush had started. The bullet wound in Alfredo's shoulder was still bleeding through the makeshift bandage when Marcus delivered the report. They were in the backup safe house, a nondescript building in the warehouse district that existed in no official records and was known to exactly 3 people. Aaliyah had taken the triplets into the bedroom, closing the door on the conversation she knew was coming, the kind of reckoning that happened in whispers and ended in blood. Marcus set a tablet on the table in front of Alfredo with the careful reverence of someone handling evidence in a murder trial. The route plan this morning was accessed by 2 people outside your immediate security detail. Mateo Reyes at 4:47 a.m., and again at 5:12 a.m. from an IP address we traced to the Garrett estate. Alfredo stared at the screen, watching security footage play out in grainy black and white. Mateo at his computer, downloading encrypted files. Then a second angle, timestamp matching, showing Anaya Garrett in her father's study, her fingers flying across a keyboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. There's more, Marcus continued, his voice carefully neutral. We traced wire transfers from a Garrett Holdings account to a shell company in the Caymans. $2 million transferred 3 days ago. The same shell company that paid Silas Vane's mercenaries for this morning's operation. They weren't just leaking information, sir. They funded the hit. The rage that flooded Alfredo's system was cold, surgical, the kind that didn't explode into violence but instead calcified into absolute certainty about what needed to happen next. Mateo had betrayed him from the beginning, had sabotaged his protection of Aaliyah, had stolen money meant to keep her safe. That betrayal was personal, painful, but at least it made a twisted kind of sense. Mateo had convinced himself it was for the good of the organization, had justified his actions with philosophy about weakness and sentiment. But Anaya had looked him in the eye, had accepted his ring, had planned a wedding while simultaneously funding mercenaries to murder the mother of his children. That wasn't philosophy or misguided loyalty. That was calculated elimination of a threat, cold-blooded and efficient, the kind of move that destroyed families while leaving no fingerprints. Where is Mateo right now? At the main estate. He thinks you're at the hospital getting the shoulder treated. He doesn't know we're here. Good. Bring him to the industrial pier. The abandoned one on the east side. And Marcus? Make sure he understands this isn't a conversation he walks away from. Marcus nodded once and left without another word. Alfredo sat alone in the silence, his shoulder throbbing with every heartbeat, and made the calculations that would determine how the next 24 hours unfolded. Mateo was a dead man. That decision had been made the moment Marcus showed him the evidence. But how Mateo died, whether it was quick or slow, public or private, that mattered. Because the execution of a traitor sent messages that rippled through the entire organization. The door to the bedroom opened, and Aaliyah emerged carrying a first aid kit that looked like it had been pulled from a disaster preparedness bunker. You're still bleeding. Take off your shirt. I'm fine. You're not fine, you're going into shock, and if you pass out before dealing with whoever betrayed you, they win. So sit down and let me fix what I can fix. There was no arguing with that tone. Alfredo eased himself into a chair and unbuttoned his shirt, exposing the blood-soaked bandage and the ugly entry wound beneath. Aaliyah's hands were steady as she cleaned the injury, her face carefully blank in that way that meant she was processing trauma by focusing on concrete tasks. The bullet went through, she said, dabbing antiseptic that burned like fire. That's good. Means nothing's lodged in there. But you need proper medical attention, Alfredo. This needs stitches at minimum, probably surgery. After what? After you kill whoever did this? After you settle your scores and burn down whatever bridges need burning. She pressed gauze against the wound with enough pressure to make him wince. I'm not stupid. I know what happens next. I grew up watching crime dramas and reading thriller novels, and I know that betrayals in your world don't get resolved with strongly worded letters and human resources complaints. Then you know I don't have a choice. You always have a choice. Aaliyah wrapped the bandage with practiced efficiency, her fingers gentle despite the anger in her voice. But I also know that the people who did this, who coordinated that ambush, they tried to kill my children. So whatever you're planning, whatever happens tonight, I'm not going to pretend I'll shed tears over it. Alfredo caught her wrist as she finished securing the bandage. I need you to stay here with the triplets. Marcus will have security outside, enough firepower to handle anything. But if something goes wrong, if I don't come back, there's a bag under the kitchen sink with cash and passports. Get out of the city and don't look back. You're talking like you're going to die. I'm talking like a realist. Mateo was my underboss for 15 years. He knows how I think, how I operate. And Anaya has her father's entire organization backing her. Taking them both down in one night isn't a guaranteed success. Aaliyah stared at him for a long moment, and Alfredo watched something shift in her expression. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't love, but maybe it was understanding. Recognition that the man who had abandoned her 2 years ago was now willing to walk into hell to protect the children he never knew existed. Come back, she said finally. Because those babies in there, they need a father. And I'm tired of doing this alone. The industrial pier was exactly as abandoned as Alfredo had hoped. Rusted shipping containers stacked like forgotten monuments, the smell of oil and decay hanging heavy in the salt air, no witnesses for miles in any direction. Marcus had delivered Mateo exactly on schedule, the underboss bound to a chair in the center of a pool of light cast by a single work lamp. Alfredo approached slowly, his shoulders screaming with every step, his good hand resting on the weapon holstered at his hip. Mateo watched him come with the calm resignation of someone who had always known this day would arrive eventually. There was no fear in his eyes, no pleading. Just acceptance. I assume you found the evidence, Mateo said, his voice steady. The route plan. The wire transfers. The whole beautiful trail you and Anaya left behind. Alfredo stopped in front of him, close enough to see the pulse beating in his underboss's throat. Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out? I thought you might be dead before you had the chance. Silas Fane's mercenaries had a 97% success rate on coordinated ambushes. You survived through luck and desperation, not skill. And yet here I am. Which means you failed. Again. Alfredo pulled his weapon, checked the magazine with movements made clumsy by his injured shoulder. You want to tell me why? Why you partnered with Anaya to murder the mother of my children? Because you were never going to let them go. Mateo leaned back in the chair as much as his restraints allowed. I saw it in your face the moment you came back from that tenement. You were done, Alfredo. Done with the calculated marriage, done with the strategic alliances, done with building an empire. You were going to throw it all away for a woman and 3 infants, and that couldn't happen. So I found someone who shared my concern, someone who had as much to lose as I did if you abandoned your responsibilities. Anaya. She approached me after you brought Aaliyah to the estate. Made it very clear that her merger with the Melendez syndicate didn't include stepchildren or ex-lovers. She wanted the problem solved, and I had the means to solve it. The partnership made sense. Alfredo raised the weapon, pointing it at Mateo's head. His hand wasn't shaking. 15 years of friendship, of brotherhood forged in violence and loyalty, and it ended here in a pool of light on an abandoned pier. You tried to kill my children. I tried to save your empire. There's a difference. Not to me. The shot echoed across the water, final and absolute. Mateo slumped in the chair, his eyes still open, staring at nothing. Alfredo stood over the body of his oldest friend and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. The betrayal had been too complete, too calculated for mercy. Mateo had made his choice, had partnered with Anaya to eliminate what he saw as weakness, and now he paid the price that all traitors paid. One down. One to go. The Garrett estate was ablaze with lights when Alfredo arrived 3 hours later. He had changed his blood-stained shirt, had taken enough painkillers to dull the fire in his shoulder, and had brought enough security to make his intentions clear. This wasn't a social call. This was a declaration of war. Marcus Garrett met him in the foyer, the older man's expression shifting from surprise to calculation as he assessed the small army Alfredo had brought with him. Melendez. This is unexpected. The wedding isn't for another 2 months. There isn't going to be a wedding. Alfredo's voice carried through the foyer, loud enough that security staff and household employees stopped what they were doing. This needed witnesses, needed to be public enough that the other families heard about it before dawn. Your daughter funded an assassination attempt on my family. She partnered with my underboss to coordinate a hit that endangered 3 infants. The engagement is over. Marcus's face went carefully blank. Those are serious accusations. They're documented facts. Wire transfers, communications logs, testimony from Mateo Reyes before his unfortunate death an hour ago. I have evidence that would hold up in any court, criminal or otherwise. Alfredo pulled out a folder thick with documents and threw it at Marcus's feet. You want to contest this? We can do it publicly. I can make sure every family in this city knows that the Garretts tried to murder children to protect a business merger. See how that affects your reputation. The threat hung in the air, sharp and devastating. In their world, certain lines were absolute. You didn't involve civilians. You didn't target children. And you definitely didn't coordinate hits on infants because they complicated your corporate ambitions. The Garrett family's reputation would be destroyed, their standing in the underworld demolished, if this information became public. Anaya appeared at the top of the stairs, still in her silk robe, her hair perfect despite the late hour. She looked down at Alfredo with an expression that mixed fury and something that might have been grudging respect. So you figured it out. Faster than I expected, I'll admit. Did you really think I wouldn't? Alfredo didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The cold fury in his tone was enough. You tried to kill the mother of my children. You funded mercenaries to open fire in a public intersection where dozens of civilians could have died. And you did it all while wearing my ring and planning a wedding. I did what was necessary to protect my interests. You brought that woman and her bastards into our world, made them a vulnerability that anyone could exploit. I simply decided to eliminate the vulnerability before someone else did. Anaya descended the stairs with the poise of someone who genuinely believed she had done nothing wrong. If you had kept your personal life separate from business, this wouldn't have been necessary. If you had any humanity whatsoever, you would have understood that those bastards are my children, and they're worth more than your entire empire. Alfredo pulled off the engagement ring he had been wearing, the symbol of an alliance that had never been about love and had ended in bloodshed. He threw it at Anaya's feet, watched it bounce on marble floors that cost more than most people's homes. The engagement is over. The merger is cancelled. And if you or your father make any move against my family, I will destroy everything the Garretts have built. Every territory, every operation, every source of income. I will leave you with nothing but debts and enemies. Are we clear? Marcus stepped forward, his hand moving toward the weapon holstered under his jacket, but Alfredo's security team was faster. A dozen weapons appeared simultaneously, all pointed at the older man, a reminder that this confrontation had only one possible outcome. We're clear, Marcus said finally, his voice tight with suppressed rage. But understand, Melendez, that you've made an enemy tonight. The Garrett family doesn't forget insults like this. Good. Then you'll remember exactly why you don't touch my children. Alfredo walked out of the Garrett estate knowing he had just destabilized the carefully balanced power structure that kept the city's underworld from descending into open warfare. The merger with the Garretts had been designed to consolidate territories, to create a unified front against rivals like Silas Vane. Without that alliance, the Melendez syndicate was more vulnerable, more exposed to attacks from multiple directions. But as he drove back to the safe house where Aaliyah and the triplets waited, Alfredo found he didn't care about strategic vulnerabilities or territorial consolidation. He had spent 2 years building an empire on calculated silence and political maneuvering, convincing himself that power was the only thing that mattered. And in pursuing that power, he had abandoned the only thing that actually gave his life meaning. Not anymore. The safe house was quiet when he arrived, the kind of silence that came with sleeping infants and exhausted mothers. Alfredo found Aaliyah in the living room, curled up on the couch with a baby monitor on the coffee table, her eyes closed but her breathing suggesting she wasn't actually asleep. It's done, he said quietly. Aaliyah's eyes opened. Both of them. Mateo is dead. Anaya and her father are ruined. The engagement is over, the alliance is cancelled, and I've made it very clear what happens to anyone who threatens you or the children. She studied him for a long moment and Alfredo let her look let her search for whatever truth she needed to find. What now? Now we disappear. There's a house outside the city, completely off the grid, unknown to anyone in the organization. We move there tomorrow, set up proper security, and we start over. No syndicate business, no calculated alliances, no empire built on violence. You're walking away from everything you built. I'm choosing what matters. Alfredo sat down next to her, his shoulder throbbing but his mind clearer than it had been in years. I spent 2 years telling myself that power was everything, that building an empire justified any sacrifice. And I was wrong. Catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. So now I'm making a different choice. What about Silas Vane? What about all the enemies you just made tonight? You think they're going to let you walk away peacefully? No. Which is why we're disappearing, why I'm setting up security that doesn't depend on anyone's loyalty but my own. The war isn't over, Aaliyah. But for the first time in my life, I'm fighting for something that actually matters. Through the window, dawn was breaking over the city, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. In 3 weeks, there would be a commission meeting where Alfredo's absence would raise questions, where rivals would smell weakness and begin positioning themselves to carve up his territories. The carefully constructed empire he had spent 15 years building would begin to crumble, piece by piece, as he withdrew from the underworld that had defined his entire adult life. And he would let it. Because the alternative, continuing to play the game while his children grew up in the shadow of violence and his second chance with Aaliyah withered under the weight of calculated decisions, that was unacceptable. 2 days later they moved to the house Alfredo had prepared. It sat on 5 acres of wooded property, modern security systems hidden behind rustic aesthetics, close enough to the city for necessities but far enough that the underworld felt like a distant memory. Aaliyah walked through the empty rooms with the triplets in her arms, and Alfredo watched her expression shift from suspicion to cautious acceptance. "This is temporary, right?" she asked, standing in what would become the nursery. "Just until things settle down? This is home. If you'll let it be." She turned to face him and Alfredo saw the war happening behind her eyes. The part of her that remembered abandonment and suffering and 2 years of hell fought against the part that saw a man genuinely trying to make amends, to build something real from the wreckage of his choices. "I'm not promising forgiveness," she said finally. "I'm not saying we're a family or that everything is okay now. But I'm willing to try. For them." She looked down at Leo, Luca, and Lexi, 3 tiny lives that represented both his greatest failure and his only real chance at redemption. "That's all I'm asking." 3 months passed. Alfredo watched from the window as Aaliyah played with the triplets in the garden, their laughter carrying on the wind like music he had forgotten existed. Leo was learning to walk. Luca had started babbling in sounds that almost resembled words. And Lexi had her mother's smile and her father's stubborn determination. The war wasn't over. Silas Vane was still out there, still circling, waiting for an opening. The commission meeting had happened without Alfredo's attendance, and rumors suggested his territories were being quietly absorbed by hungrier predators. Marcus Garrett had made noise about vengeance and honor, though so far it had been all talk and no action. But standing in this house, watching the vibrant light return to Aaliyah's eyes as she chased their children through autumn leaves, Alfredo knew he had made the right choice. He had spent 2 years building an empire on calculated silence and strategic violence, convincing himself that power was the only currency that mattered. He had been wrong. This was what mattered. The sound of children laughing. The sight of Aaliyah smiling for the first time in years. The knowledge that he was building something real. Something that couldn't be stolen or destroyed by ambitious rivals or internal betrayals. And if the underworld came for them again, if Silas Vane or the Garretts or anyone else decided that his family represented an opportunity or a target, Alfredo would meet them with the full force of the violence he had spent a lifetime perfecting. He had walked away from the syndicate, from the calculated game of territories and power plays. But he hadn't forgotten how to fight. And he would burn the entire city to ashes before he let that vibrant light flicker out again.